Night doesn't fall over Wallachia. It descends, heavy and suffocating, as if the sky itself is warning anyone foolish enough to wander its roads. The Ottoman soldiers know this land. They've marched through deserts, storms, and battlefields, but nothing feels like this. The air is thick, sticky, carrying a stench that coils into their throats. Burnt tar, smoke, and the sour, unmistakable scent of human decay. Torches aren't lights anymore. They're trembling sparks clutched by hands trying not to shake. The forest around them is dead silent. No wolves. No wind. Even the leaves seem to hold their breath. The captain lifts a hand to halt the column, but before he can speak, someone in the back whispers, voice cracked with fear. Turn back. This is his land. The Impaler hunts at night. No one laughs. No one breathes. Every man knows the stories of prisoners who vanished, of soldiers who entered these woods and were never seen again. They take one careful step forward, then another, and then the tree breaks, and the world becomes a nightmare. An entire valley lies below them, bathed in cold moonlight, filled with bodies. Not lying on the ground, not buried, but rising into the sky, impaled on towering wooden stakes, thousands of them, stretching across the land like a twisted kingdom of the dead. Even from a distance, the soldiers can see the shapes, the limbs, the frozen mouths, the way the stakes sway softly in the wind, creaking like a chorus of ghosts. The veterans, men who've watched empires burn, feel their knees weaken. One drops his torch. Another vomits into the dirt. A third starts praying to a god he hasn't spoken to in years. And in that moment, every soldier realizes the same truth. This isn't a battlefield. This is a message. And Vlad the Impaler carved it with terrifying precision. If this single moment shook you even a little, don't scroll past. Like this video right now, subscribe and drop a comment, because what you're about to hear next is darker, colder, and far more terrifying than anything these men saw when they stepped into the Valley of the Impaled. And this is only the beginning. They stand in the Valley of the Impaled, torches trembling, breath unsteady, the moonlight shivering across thousands of lifeless forms, and it's here that the truth becomes impossible to ignore. What they're looking at isn't madness. It isn't chaos. It isn't some blood-soaked tantrum carved out by a violent ruler with too much power. It is order. Cold. Calculated. Intentional. Every stake is placed with precision. Every body arranged with purpose. Every detail crafted to send a message that would travel farther than any soldier, any scout, any rumor ever could. Because Vlad's actions were never simple cruelty. They were a language, spoken not with words but with terror. A message aimed not at the weak but at the strong. Not at the prisoners lying on those stakes, but at the empire marching toward him. The Ottomans weren't meant to just see this. They were meant to feel it, deep in their bones. A reminder that Wallachia was not a land to be swallowed easily. That its ruler was not a frightened prince begging for mercy, but a strategist who understood something far older, far darker than military tactics. Fear moves faster than armies. Fear weakens before a single sword is drawn. Fear conquers without a battle. And Vlad, raised between borders, forged in captivity, shaped by betrayals, learned fear the way others learn languages. He didn't use it recklessly. He used it with surgical clarity. To understand how he became this, how a man could orchestrate terror so precisely that an empire trembled, we must turn back. Not just to his throne, not just to his wars, but to the beginning. To a young boy taken from home. To a hostage living under the shadow of the very empire he would one day defy. To a childhood spent learning the customs, commands, and cruelty of the Ottomans themselves. To the moment when innocence ended and purpose began. Because the man who created the Valley of the Impaled wasn't born in darkness. He was shaped by it. And every terrifying choice he made afterward, the prisoners displayed like warnings, the forests turned into monuments of dread, was not insanity. It was clarity. a strategy carved from a lifetime of understanding exactly what frightened his enemies most. Even the greatest empire of the age, even men who had marched across continents and toppled kingdoms, found themselves hesitating at the edge of this valley because they knew deep down, this was no ordinary ruler. This was no ordinary resistance. And this horrifying sight, was not the peak of his brutality. It was merely the opening statement. So to grasp why the Ottomans, with all their power, all their armies, all their pride, feared him, we have to go back to the world he was born into. A world of shifting loyalties, desperate borders, and a prince who learned very early that survival required more than strength. It required the ability to terrify those who once believed they could control him. And that is where his story truly begins. To understand the man who would one day turn a valley into a monument of terror, the story must drift back, far from the stakes, far from the moonlit silence, into a world already burning long before Vlad ever drew breath. The Balkans were not a peaceful place. They were a crossroads where empires collided, a land where borders shifted like sand, where kings rose and vanished in the same breath. Power was never stable. Loyalty was never certain. And Wallachia, small, poor, and fiercely independent, stood trapped between two giants. To the south, the Ottoman Empire, expanding with the hunger of a rising storm. To the west, the Kingdom of Hungary, older, wealthier, determined to keep the Ottomans from swallowing Europe whole. Wallachia was the battleground between them, forced to kneel, rise, kneel again. Its rulers lived in constant fear, knowing their crowns were made not of gold, but of obligations, threats, and shifting alliances. It was into this world that Vlad was born, the son of Vlad Dracula, a prince who tried desperately to keep his fragile land alive. But survival back then required more than diplomacy. The Ottomans demanded loyalty, tribute, and something even heavier. They demanded hostages. Not prisoners. Not criminals. Hostages of noble blood. Children used as living guarantees that their fathers would obey. Vlad was one of them. Taken from his home at a young age, he and his brother were delivered into the heart of the Ottoman Empire. And it was there, behind foreign walls, under foreign eyes, that Vlad learned the lessons no child should ever learn. He saw discipline enforced with whips. He saw punishment carried out with cold efficiency. He watched as soldiers trained, fought, and killed with methods far more brutal than anything Wallachia had ever known. He understood something else too. A hostage is not a guest. A hostage is a warning. Every smile from his captors carried a threat. Every gesture of kindness was a reminder that it could be taken away in a heartbeat. Vlad lived with the constant knowledge that his life was a tool, valuable only as long as his father obeyed. And beneath that pressure, something began to form inside him. A hardness, a sharpness, a quiet rage growing in the shadows of empire. But this captivity didn't just fill him with hatred. It taught him how the Ottomans thought, how their armies marched, how their punishments worked, how fear was used as a weapon, carefully, deliberately, to control nations without lifting a sword. He learned their strategies, their discipline, their ambition. And he learned their weaknesses. Years passed. And when his father was eventually betrayed and killed, Vlad's captivity ceased to be a political arrangement. It became a threat to his life. He understood even then that survival demanded more than obedience. It demanded becoming something the Ottomans did not expect. Something they could not easily break. When Vlad finally returned to Wallachia, he didn't return as a frightened child torn from home. He returned with the eyes of someone who had grown up inside the jaws of an empire and survived the pressure. And the world he stepped back into had only grown harsher. Wallachia was fractured by nobles clawing for power. Peasants starved. Roads were haunted by bandits. Enemies watched from every direction. Violence was not the exception, it was the rule. Every village carried scars, every border spilled blood, every ruler struggled to stay alive long enough to make a difference. This was the world Vlad inherited. A world where mercy was mistaken for weakness. A world where brutality was not admired but expected. A world where only the ruthless survived. And standing between the might of the Ottomans and the ambitions of the Hungarians, one truth became clear. A gentle prince would be destroyed. A hesitant prince would be swallowed whole. Only a ruler who understood the language of terror, its weight, its purpose, its power, could keep Wallachia from disappearing altogether. The child taken as a hostage returned as something very different. Something shaped by captivity, sharpened by fear, trained by empire. And soon the world would learn his name again, not as a victim, but as the Impaler. When Vlad finally returned to Wallachia, he came home to a land that barely recognized him, and a land he barely recognized in return. The fields were poorer, the nobles more treacherous, the borders thinner, the fear thicker. But beneath all that, something else lingered. The quiet hope that anyone could stand against the storm pressing in from every side. Vlad did not return as a lost son searching for comfort. He returned as a man carved sharp by captivity, trained in the shadows of an empire, and ready to claim what had been stolen from his family. And he knew something the nobles did not. Wallachia could no longer afford a gentle ruler. The throne he sought was not empty, it was contested by rivals supported by the Ottomans, men who believed Vlad would remain a frightened exile forever. But they didn't understand what he had become. They didn't see the cold calculation behind his silence, the strategy behind his patience, the fire in his eyes that had survived years of being treated as a bargaining chip. Vlad moved with precision. He struck alliances where they mattered, broke them when necessary, and used every scrap of knowledge he had learned from the Ottomans against the very people who once held him captive. He reclaimed his seat not through ceremony, but through cunning, timing, and a ferocity that shocked even those who had supported him. And once he had the throne, he wasted no time. Wallachia had rotted from within. Corrupt boyars who had betrayed his father, nobles who sold loyalty to the highest bidder, factions who would gladly give the land away if it meant keeping their own power. Vlad understood something vital. Before he could face the Ottomans, he had to break the chaos inside his own walls. And he did. Swiftly. Ruthlessly. Publicly. Those who had betrayed his father disappeared. Those who undermined him met the consequences. Those who plotted against his rule learned that mercy was no longer the currency of the court. Order returned not through gentle persuasion, but through the cold, unmistakable clarity of a ruler who refused to be manipulated again. With his internal enemies crushed, Vlad turned his attention outward, toward the threats circling his borders. It was in these early campaigns that his most infamous method appeared, not yet as legend but as strategy. Impalement, not used wildly, not used carelessly, but placed deliberately like punctuation marks on the battlefield. A handful of captured raiders, a line of captured spies, a group of nobles caught sabotaging Wallachia's defenses. Their fates were displayed along the roadside or at the gates of towns, silent, towering statements carved against the sky. And the message was unmistakable. This land will not be taken easily. To those who lived in Wallachia, the stakes were warnings. To those who meant harm, they were promises. To those passing through, they were unforgettable. Whispers began. Stories drifted across taverns and campfires. Soldiers arriving home from distant marches described the silence of the woods, broken only by the groans of the dying. Traders claimed that even the crows seemed afraid of the stakes. Villagers spoke of a prince who could stand against giants because he understood the one thing every empire feared, an enemy who refused to bow. And slowly the stories changed him. He was no longer simply Vlad. No longer the prince who returned from captivity. No longer the son of a murdered ruler. He became something else entirely. A warning carried by wind. A shadow whispered in the tents of armies. A name that made even hardened soldiers lower their voices at night. The man who had once been a hostage was now becoming a myth, a ruler who wielded terror not for cruelty's sake, but as the only language his enemies understood. A prince rising step by step toward a legacy that would outlive even his own blood. The Impaler was taking shape. For a time, Vlad's rule brought a harsh stability to Wallachia, harsh but effective. Villages that once lived in fear of raiders now slept with their doors unlocked. Roads long abandoned to bandits came alive again with traders and caravans. Word spread far beyond Wallachia's borders that its ruler was not merely firm, he was immovable. And that was precisely what drew the Ottomans' attention. The empire expected obedience. They expected tribute. They expected a Wallachian prince to bow, smile, and pretend he held any authority that wasn't granted by their goodwill. Vlad did not. He paid tribute late. He questioned demands. He strengthened his borders instead of weakening them. Then came the moment that shattered any illusion of compromise. The Ottomans sent envoys to Wallachia, men of status, wrapped in fine robes, carrying themselves with the confidence of those who believed their empire was beyond insult. When they entered Vlad's court, he noticed immediately that they refused to remove their turbans, a deliberate gesture of disrespect in Wallachian custom. He asked why. They replied calmly, almost proudly, that their turbans never left their heads, not in the presence of kings, nor on foreign soil, nor in any hall that did not belong to their own sultan. It was meant as a reminder of superiority. Vlad accepted their answer with unsettling stillness. He smiled, an expression that sent a quiet ripple of unease through the court. And then he gave an order that would echo across the empire. If they would not remove their turbans out of respect, he said they should be helped to keep them on. His soldiers seized the envoys. The hall fell silent. And Vlad commanded that the turbans be nailed to their skulls. Not with cruelty, not with anger, but with a terrifying, deliberate calm. The message was unmistakable. If the Ottomans came to Wallachia expecting obedience, they had misjudged the man on its throne. When news of this act reached the Ottoman court, the shock was instant. These were not prisoners, not raiders, not spies. They were official messengers, men protected under the sacred law of diplomacy. And Vlad had turned their arrogance into a warning. From that moment, the Ottomans no longer saw him as a troublesome prince or a rebellious vassal. They saw him as something far more inconvenient, a threat, one that could not be tolerated, one that had to be crushed decisively and publicly. What followed was not a diplomatic rift, but the beginning of a storm, a campaign, a preparation for a war the Ottomans believed would be swift and overwhelming. But Vlad knew what he had done. He knew what response would come, and he was ready. If you're shocked already, if this moment made you pause, imagine how the Ottomans felt when the news reached their palace. Hit subscribe now, because what comes next becomes far darker than even this. War did not descend on Wallachia all at once. It arrived in fragments, shadows on the border, skirmishes in the mountains, riders spotted on distant hills. The Ottomans began probing Vlad's defenses, testing his patience, searching for weaknesses. And each time they came, even in small numbers, they expected the same thing they had come to expect from vassal states everywhere: surrender, tribute, fear. But Vlad gave them none of it. Instead, he struck first. Small Ottoman detachments were ambushed along riverbanks and forest paths. Scouts disappeared without a trace. Supply wagons burned in the night with no attackers in sight. And those who survived these encounters returned with stories that spread through the ranks like illness. Stories of silence in the trees. Stories of shadows that moved faster than men. Stories of capture, not death, and what waited after. Because Vlad did not simply kill the soldiers he captured. He held them, listened to them, observed them, then planned what would come next with a calmness that unnerved even his own commanders. Every prisoner taken in those early campaigns became a piece of a larger design, one only Vlad understood fully. Other leaders would have ransomed them back, or executed them quietly. But Vlad saw in them something else, an opportunity to craft a message powerful enough to travel ahead of any army. He was not trying to win a battle. He was preparing to win a mind. Word began to drift through Ottoman camps, carried on frightened whispers. He doesn't just kill you, he doesn't bury you, he displays you. Soldiers spoke of comrades who vanished during patrols, only to be found days later, upright, silent, and pale against the skyline. Others told of prisoners seen being dragged toward the interior of Wallachia, toward some hidden place, some preparation that no one could quite describe. No one knew the full plan, but everyone felt it. Even the commanders noticed the change. Confidence faltered. Jokes died quickly. Eyes watched the tree line too long. The Ottomans were not frightened of battle. They had crushed kingdoms and marched across continents. What rattled them now was something unfamiliar. An enemy who fought with psychology, not just steel. An enemy who understood that terror could hollow out an army long before swords touched. Meanwhile, Vlad worked with unnerving steadiness. He selected the field. He chose the stakes. He arranged the spacing. He prepared the valley like a stage, one designed not for battle but for memory. His soldiers watched him move with a cold focus that bordered on ritual. He gave no speeches. He offered no explanations. He simply built, planned, and sharpened his message until it was ready to be carved into the land itself. The prisoners he had captured earlier were gathered, not in anger but in absolute order. Every man placed with purpose. Every moment designed to echo. Every detail meant to be seen, truly seen, by the invaders marching toward Wallachia. Because Vlad understood one truth that few rulers ever grasped. The most powerful weapon in war is not the sword. It is the imagination. And he was about to ignite the Ottoman imagination with a vision so horrific, so unforgettable, that even hardened veterans would question whether the road ahead was worth walking. The valley was waiting. The stakes were ready. And the Ottomans were marching straight toward a message crafted just for them. What they would find there would not simply stop an army. It would haunt them. The valley chosen for the display was not random. Vlad had studied every inch of it, its slope, its visibility, the way sound carried through the trees. It was a natural amphitheater, the kind of place where even a whisper could feel larger than life. And into that quiet stage, he prepared to carve the message that would echo across an empire. The Ottoman prisoners, captured over weeks of raids and ambushes, were brought forward under strict guard. There was no chaos, no fury. Everything moved with chilling precision. Vlad was not a man lashing out. He was a man demonstrating. The stakes had been prepared days earlier, tall, smooth poles sharpened to tapered points. They stood in long rows, forming paths and clusters, almost geometric in their arrangement. Some were taller than a rider on horseback, others shorter and set deliberately at uneven heights. It was less like a battlefield and more like a grim forest rising from the earth itself. When the prisoners realized what awaited them, panic spread through their ranks. Yet it didn't matter. Vlad's soldiers were trained, focused, exact. What followed was not a quick execution but a slow, controlled ritual engineered to prolong suffering without crossing into needless gore. The stakes were designed to enter the body in a way that avoided vital organs at first, ensuring the victim remained conscious for hours, sometimes longer, suspended between earth and sky in agonizing stillness. Men were raised into the air, their bodies sliding down the smooth wood with dreadful slowness. Some cried out. Some couldn't make a sound. Some simply stared ahead, eyes wide, as if their minds had fled somewhere far beyond the valley. When each stake was fully set into the ground, the victims hung there, alive, silent, swaying gently in the breeze like terrible lanterns of suffering. And Vlad watched every placement with measured attention. Not cruelty, not pleasure, just purpose. He spaced them carefully, some in tight clusters like thick groves of trees, others in long lines forming avenues of terror. A few were arranged on rises in the land so they could be seen from a distance, rising above the valley like dark sentinels. By the time the final stake was in place, the valley had transformed completely. What had once been an empty clearing was now a world of upright bodies, thousands of them, stretching so far that even the horizon seemed weighed down by their presence. It was a sight meant to be seared into memory. And when the Ottoman army finally marched into view days later, they saw it. At first they slowed. Then they stopped altogether. Veteran soldiers, men who had marched behind sultans, crossed continents, taken cities, stood frozen in absolute disbelief. The scale of the display was beyond comprehension. The silence of the valley felt unnatural, as though the land itself was holding its breath. And the sheer number of bodies, each placed with such meticulous precision, shattered their confidence in a single instant. Some soldiers dropped their weapons where they stood. Others could not stop shaking. A few turned their faces away, unable to look at the forest of suffering rising before them. Because this was not a battlefield. This was a message. A declaration written in suffering that said, "If you come further, this will be your fate." Even the Sultan's generals, hardened by decades of war, felt a knot form in their chests. They understood what Vlad had done. He hadn't tried to defeat them with strength. He had tried to defeat them with imagination, by showing them a future they were not sure they wanted to meet. And for a moment, that vast, unstoppable army hesitated. If this level of psychological warfare terrifies you, even a little, press like right now. It helps more curious minds find stories like this, and trust me, what comes next is even darker. When the Ottoman vanguard first saw the valley, their silence spread backward through the ranks like a slow-moving wave. By the time the news reached the command tents, the sun had begun to sink behind the ridges, casting long shadows across the impaled forest. No one wanted to speak first. No one wanted to be the one to describe what lay ahead. But eventually the reports reached the man at the center of the campaign, Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, the ruler whose armies had crushed cities that once believed themselves eternal. He was not a man easily shaken. He had seen sieges, massacres, plagues, rebellions. He had stood inside Hagia Sophia as it fell silent for the last time. Nothing surprised him anymore. Until this. The moment his commanders unfolded the first account, written in a trembling hand, Mehmed paused. Not long. Not dramatically. But long enough for those around him to feel the shift in the air. He stepped outside, rode forward, and stood overlooking the valley from a distant ridge. What he saw forced him into stillness. A landscape transformed into a monument of suffering, stretching far beyond what his generals had described. A valley filled not with fallen warriors, but with upright forms, thousands of them, standing against the sky like a distorted, nightmarish forest. Some swayed slightly in the breeze. Some were tall enough to be seen from leagues away. And all carried the same message. Turn back. Behind him, the generals waited for his command. But even they, men hardened by endless war, could not maintain their composure. The smell alone was enough to break the strongest stomach. Several officers turned away, covering their faces. Soldiers farther down the slope dropped to their knees. Some retched into the dirt, unable to look at the sight before them. Others clutched their robes or their weapons, whispering prayers under their breath. A few outright refused to advance. No threats, no orders from commanders could push them forward. The valley had stripped them of something deeper than courage. It had attacked their imagination, their sense of fate, their belief that the world followed rules they understood. Because this was something else entirely. The Ottoman army, one of the strongest forces on earth, had been halted not by fortifications, not by cavalry, not by walls or archers, but by fear. It was the first time many of these men understood exactly what Vlad had created. He had not tried to destroy them with numbers. He had tried to hollow them out from the inside, to make them question their mission before a single blade was drawn, to force them to carry the valley's image with them, whether they marched forward or turned back. And it worked. The front lines hesitated. The middle ranks murmured anxiously. The rear ranks began to drift away, unsure, unsettled. Entire divisions slowed to a crawl. Communication broke apart. The unity of the army fractured under the weight of a single horrifying sight. Even Mehmed, after several long moments, finally spoke, but only softly. "This man fights with shadows." He did not mean darkness. He meant fear. Fear shaped so powerfully that it moved faster than armies, climbed higher than walls, and sank deeper than swords could ever reach. What Vlad had crafted in that valley did more than disgust an army. It stalled an empire. For the first time in years, the Ottoman advance faltered. Not because they had been defeated. Not because they were outnumbered. But because the valley forced them to imagine what would happen if they continued. And imagination, Vlad knew, was a weapon sharper than anything forged in steel. The Ottomans withdrew from the valley carrying more than the memory of suffering. They carried its echo. Men who had marched beneath the banners of a world-conquering empire now marched in silence, unsure whether the shadows moving in the trees were real soldiers or the ghosts of what they had just witnessed. They looked over their shoulders more than ahead. The retreat was orderly on paper, but in spirit it was broken. Fear had become a companion in the ranks, and Vlad knew it. He watched from the heights of Wallachia as torchlines of the retreating army dimmed and disappeared into the southern dark. To any other ruler, the sight would have brought relief. To Vlad, it brought opportunity. Because for him, the aftermath was not rest. It was strategy. Messengers rode out across Wallachia carrying not news, but narrative. The valley was described in whispers, then in murmurs, then in stories exaggerated by trembling voices. Each tale spread faster than the last. The forest of stakes grew taller in every retelling, the victims more numerous, the silence more unbearable. Reality had been terrifying. Myth would be unstoppable. And soon even those who had never seen the valley felt as though they had walked through it themselves. Peasants began lighting candles at their doorsteps, not for the souls of the dead, but to keep the memory away. Nobles spoke his name with a careful steadiness, as though saying it too quickly might summon him. Children were told to behave not because God was watching, but because Vlad was. The legend was taking shape. But legends can only grow when someone feeds them. So Vlad fed it. Where borders were weak, he reinforced them not with walls, but with warnings. Stakes rose along mountain passes, river crossings, hidden trails used by smugglers and spies. Not in the same terrible concentration as the valley, but placed just enough for any wanderer to understand the message. You are entering a land ruled by a man who does not fear empires. You should, however, fear him. And beyond Wallachia, the stories evolved further. Travelers carried tales to Transylvania, to Hungary, to the ports of the Black Sea. In taverns from Buda to Belgrade, men leaned in close to share what they had heard. That Wallachia was guarded not by armies, but by a prince carved from iron, sharpened by captivity, and willing to defy an empire with terror alone. The Ottomans had retreated, but their retreat created a vacuum filled by rumor. Across the border, Mehmed studied the reports piling on his desk. Scouts spoke of rustling leaves that made patrols jump. Merchants claimed that the forests themselves felt hostile. Even seasoned generals, men who had commanded sieges and crushed rebellions, warned him that this was no ordinary enemy. Vlad had rewritten the rules of fear. He didn't wait for daylight. He didn't wait for battle lines. He struck caravans, isolated units, lone riders, always at night, always from the shadows, always leaving behind a single visible truth. There is no safety here. Men began to dread nighttime marches. Campfires burned weaker. Songs disappeared. Every movement outside the tents felt like the beginning of another nightmare. This was not war. This was psychological erosion. And as that erosion deepened, Vlad pressed further. The villages near the border, once vulnerable, now served as the first line of his message warfare. Doors were marked with symbols understood by Wallachians but perplexing to foreigners, warnings disguised as folk signs. Towns rang their bells differently when soldiers approached, some to signal safety, others to lure invaders into prepared traps. Even the land itself seemed to collaborate, shaped by Vlad's knowledge of every hill, every creek, every hidden path. Wallachia became a living fortress, and Vlad its conductor. Yet beneath the terror and the strategy lay something deeper. The certainty that this land would not survive gentleness. Every stake, every warning, every night raid was driven by the same unspoken truth. Wallachia was too small to win by strength, but not too small to win by fear. As the months passed, Mehmed found his empire in an unfamiliar position. Not defeated, but embarrassed. Not threatened by armies, but by imagination. The Sultan who had broken Constantinople now faced a new kind of enemy. A ruler who fought with symbolism, shadows, and shock. Where empires used numbers, Vlad used narrative. Where they marched openly, he struck invisibly. Where they sought to crush, he sought to persuade. Through horror so precise it seemed mythical. And the world listened. Because long after armies returned home, long after soldiers dispersed across cities and provinces, one image remained. The valley. Not the sights, not the smell, not the cries, but the knowledge of what one man was willing to carve into the earth to defend his land. That knowledge traveled farther than any soldier. It crossed borders, entered courts, slipped into the dreams of kings, settled into the nightmares of soldiers, and rooted itself deep inside the Ottoman psyche. So when Mehmed finally gathered his advisors to discuss the next phase, the room was quiet, not out of respect but out of dread. For the first time in his reign, the Sultan faced an opponent who did not rely on fortune or allies or armies. He faced a man who turned fear itself into a frontier. And somewhere in the dark forests of Wallachia, Vlad waited. Silent, patient, watching the empire reel from a battle that had barely begun. The valley had been his message. The aftermath was his advantage. And the war of shadows was only just beginning. Vlad's war was not fought only with steel. Its echoes, its fears, its symbols, became the foundations of his legacy. To Wallachians he became a shield. To the Ottomans a specter. And to the centuries that followed, something else entirely. But legacy is never born in peace. It grows out of chaos, out of whispered stories carried through generations, out of victories no one expected, out of horrors no one forgot. And as the smoke of his campaigns drifted into memory, the world began shaping its own version of Vlad. For Wallachia, his deeds became survival. To a land surrounded by empires that consumed kingdoms like fire consumes dry grass, his cruelty was not madness, it was armor. Every stake, every warning, every night raid was remembered not as bloodlust, but as the brutal necessity of a ruler defending a fragile frontier. They saw him not as a monster, but as the only man willing to stand between their homes and annihilation. Songs emerged. Older villagers retold the nights when roadways suddenly became safe, when bandits fled into the hills, when nobles who preyed on the weak vanished into silence. Travelers spoke of how the price of wheat stabilized, how caravans reached markets again, how the forests, once feared, were patrolled by riders loyal to the prince. They called him the defender, the justice bringer, the man who would not kneel. For Wallachia, his legend grew like a torch in the dark, fierce, steady, unshakable. But to the Ottomans that same flame burned a very different color. Their chroniclers wrote of him not as a prince, but as a fiend. A man carved not from courage, but from cruelty. A creature who delighted in torment, who raised forests of death, who fought with inhuman resolve. They described the valley not as strategy, but as monstrosity. They painted him as a being beyond reason, beyond mercy, beyond humanity. Where Wallachia saw a protector, they saw a demon. And so, two myths formed, parallel, contradictory, inseparable. One carved in pride, one carved in terror. As decades passed and empires shifted, these stories left the borders of Wallachia and the Ottoman lands. Merchants carried them along trade routes. Pilgrims whispered them in candlelit inns. Chroniclers wrote them in margins of dusty manuscripts. Each retelling grew darker, stranger, larger than life. Soon Vlad ceased to be a man in memory. He became a shape, an idea, something lurking at the crossroads of history and nightmare. Stories twisted. Some said he could not be killed. Others claimed he drank the blood of enemies to gain their strength. Others insisted he was born beneath an omen, destined for darkness. The truth had long since scattered into fragments. And centuries later, a wandering writer from Ireland, searching for the perfect villain, came across a name, a title, a legend that lingered like smoke across the Carpathians. Dracula, the son of the dragon. To Victorian imaginations, thirsty for Gothic shadows, the stories of Vlad's terror became something supernatural. The forests of stakes became forests of undead. His night raids became hunts across moonlit peaks. His unbroken will became immortality. His defiance of empire became the rebellion of a monster against the world. And the man who fought an empire with fear became the vampire who fed on fear itself. But beneath all the myth-making, all the Gothic reinvention, all the horror that later centuries adored, the core of Vlad's legacy remained grounded in a simple, brutal truth. He ruled a land that should have been swallowed. He faced enemies who should have erased his borders. He led a people who had no reason to survive the century. And yet they did. Not because of diplomacy. Not because of armies. But because of a ruler who understood that survival sometimes demands becoming the nightmare your enemies fear most. His brutality was not a legend to his people. It was a strategy. A way to carve space in a world that offered no mercy to the small and no sympathy to the endangered. In the end, his legacy split like lightning across history. A national defender in the mountains he refused to abandon. A demon in the chronicles of the empire he refused to obey. A myth in the stories of a world that could not comprehend the choices of a prince trapped between survival and extinction. And in that fracture, between hero and monster, man and myth, strategy and savagery, the name Dracula found its immortality. Vlad did not choose the legend, but he created the world that demanded it. In the end, Vlad's legacy forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Symbols outlast armies. Empires rise, conquer, and collapse into dust, but a symbol, especially one carved in fear, can echo across centuries. Vlad understood this with a clarity few rulers ever reach. He grasped that a message seared into the imagination of an enemy could halt their march longer than any fortress wall. His valley of stakes did not defeat the Ottomans, but it slowed them. It stunned them. It made them hesitate in a world where hesitation was death. His terror bought Wallachia time, precious, fleeting time, at a price that still bleeds into history. Because every act of brutality leaves two scars, one on the victim, and one on the memory of the man who ordered it. For Wallachia, that memory became protection. People told their children stories not of cruelty but of resolve, of a prince who refused to bend even when the world demanded it. They remembered fields saved, roads secured, villages kept alive because he was willing to become the weapon others feared. For the Ottomans, the same memory became proof of inhumanity. Chroniclers wrote his name dripping with venom. Generals cursed him in their dispatches. Soldiers saw him not as a ruler, but as a shadow waiting at the tree-line. Two visions of the same man. Two truths forged from the same axe. Two histories staring at each other through the fog. And somewhere in the space between those truths lies the question that will never fully settle. Was Vlad a monster? Or a ruler cornered by impossible odds? Was he carving fear out of cruelty? Or carving space for his people in a world where mercy would have been suicide? History rarely gives us clean answers. It gives us choices. Choices made in desperation, choices made in darkness, choices made by men who believed they had no other path. And Vlad's path was carved through the impossible. A tiny principality surrounded by powers that devoured kingdoms. A throne taken through betrayal and blood. An enemy that outnumbered his people 50-1. A childhood spent as a hostage to the empire he would one day defy. In that world, perhaps brutality was not a flaw. Perhaps it was the only language anyone respected. Perhaps the nightmare was the price of survival. And as the centuries rolled on, the world softened the details, embellished the terror, and shaped him into a legend that served its own needs. Hero, defender, tyrant, demon, vampire. But beneath all those layers, the real man remains. A ruler fighting for a land so small it could barely be found on a map, against an enemy so large it could swallow continents. A man who believed that if fear was the only shield he had, then fear would be the shield he forged. And that brings us to the final, unsettling reflection, the one history whispers but rarely speaks aloud. The line between hero and nightmare is not drawn by deeds or ethics or time. It is drawn by geography, by which flag flies over your home, by which army marches toward your village, by which ruler claims to defend you. Stand on one side of the border, and Vlad is the protector who saved Wallachia from extinction. Stand on the other side, and he is the horror that stalked the night. And somewhere in the thin space between those borders lies the truth. Heroes and monsters are often the same shape, and history chooses their names. History is filled with shadows. Moments buried, moments distorted, moments so dark that entire generations tried to forget them. But forgetting never changes what happened. It only silences the lessons carved into the past. Vlad's story is one of those lessons, a reminder that humanity's greatest terrors and greatest acts of defiance often spring from the same soil. A reminder that survival sometimes demands choices the world will judge for centuries. A reminder that behind every legend, whether carved as hero or demon, stands a human being shaped by forces larger than themselves. Stories like this were never meant to be told. Not by those who feared them. Not by those who lived them. Not by those who tried to bury them underneath cleaner, more comfortable versions of history. But we tell them here. We explore them. We confront them. We drag them into the light so we can understand what they reveal about us. About power, fear, courage, and the thin line humans walk when the world gives them no mercy. So if this journey held you, if even one moment made you pause or shiver or look at history differently, then take a second right now to hit like. Subscribe so you never miss the stories the world tried to hide. And drop a single word in the comments, more. Because every time you do, you help us reach deeper into the forgotten corners of the past. You help these stories rise from the dust. And you help us keep uncovering the darkest, most haunting truths humanity ever carved into its own timeline. Until next time, stay curious and stay brave. The past is darker than you think, and we're only just beginning to explore it.